understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast, and we are going to continue our little mini-series on Europe. We started in Germany the other day. We're now going to talk about the continent of Europe against the background of something that John was very worried about. He came in like Chamberlain with his white piece of paper, this peace in our times. And it wasn't. It was like anxiety in our times, a little piece of paper this morning, worried about all things European. This is because you've become a francophone.
I have. I've spent more time in France in the last year and love it. I'm going to go back again.
But you were worried about all things European.
But all things European, including wine, but we'll get to that.
Okay.
But let's talk about Draghi, because we were
Mario Draghi, the former, let's just identify who he is.
Yes.
Right. So Mario Draghi was an economics professor from Florence. He then became a technocrat in the central bank of Italy.
Yeah.
He then became the boss man, I think, in the Central Bank of Italy. He then went to Goldman Sachs.
He's had of a career, isn't he?
Yeah. He then went to became the head of the ECB, where he was the man who said, I will do whatever it takes to save the euro. He basically said to the financial markets, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, in 2012-13. And he opened up the spigots, and he basically said, the Central Bank of Europe, the ECB, is bigger than you. You want to bet against the euro to the markets?
Yeah.
Come on, have a go. So he's a boss man. He was then made the technocratic prime minister of Italy when the Italians were going through one of their various phases where they couldn't get a PM. So he's a big guy. And this week he published a report.
Yes, and which is another version of whatever it takes kind of vibe, because he published this report on what Europe needs to do. The gap between Europe and America has been growing for the past 20 years.
About that, yeah.
And his report, his recommendation is that Europe invests up to 800 billion every year to close the gap, and invest it in technology and whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes. So basically this podcast is going to be on why Europe is racked by economic insecurity, why the Europeans have fallen back dramatically against the Americans in the last 20 years. And people wouldn't have predicted that. Why Europe is falling back against Asia, and why there is a general perception that the European continental economy is going into what could be known as a secular decline. Not just a slowing down, but a decline. And again, this all comes against the background, if you're Irish, of Ireland's problem with Europe because of us being half American, half European. We are really sticking out like a sore thumb, simply because American economics, commerce and finance is so much more vibrant than European.
And is that because Europe, we're just a bit tired? You know, because we're old.
Well,
I'm joking, but I kind of mean that seriously. Like, we're an old population and getting older, therefore perhaps don't have as many innovators, don't have the same kind of energy. Do you know what I mean?
Maybe. Well, let's look at the whole thing. Let's take a bit of altitude. Right? Let's rise above the issue. I'm going to contrast, because there is a perception, and it's based on reality, that the European economy is sluggish, slowing down, conservative, not innovative, not risk-taking. Unemployment is rising. There is a hell of a lot of political movements now swinging to the right, as we saw in Germany, and to the extreme left, looking for a big state to protect us. Globalization hasn't worked out for European countries in the way many countries hoped it would. And of course, you've got on top of that immigration. You've got the sense that China is winning in many of manufacturing areas. There's also the sense that America is winning in technology. There's also the overwhelming anxiety that Europe can't defend itself. Russia has exposed that the Europeans don't have a defense industry.
You spoke before about how Europe was outsourcing everything, outsourcing defense, our energy, our consumers.
Yeah, and so the sense is that, Europe becomes like a sort of a theme park.
What do you mean by that?
So Joseph Borrell, who is the European foreign policy chief, now whatever that means, right?
Okay.
The EU's foreign policy chief, right? He made a speech in Bruges, the university I went to, which is where they all make these big speeches that are faux pas. That's when Mrs. Thatcher made her Bruges speech, right? So he made this speech, and this was 2 years ago, right? And it was in response to immigration, right?
Yeah.
And he said, Europe is a garden. We have built a garden. Everything works. It is the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that the humankind has been able to build these three things together. The rest of the world, he went on, is not exactly a garden. Most of the rest of the world is a jungle, and the jungle could invade the garden. Right.
Wow.
But that is right now. If that
There's a lot of undertones there, aren't there?
White man talks about jungles. Not good idea. But basically, picking up on
the rest of the world needs some pruning.
Yes, but Draghi picks up on this idea, and it's the notion that Europe is a beautiful place to retire, amazing place to work in, let's say, the public sector. If you have a job in the public sector, we've got beautiful architecture. We have reasonably good weather in the south. We have amazing history. We have amazing cuisine. We have political freedoms. All this. We are the garden, right? And outside is the jungle. But what Draghi is saying is the garden is infertile. The garden is condemned. The garden needs a gardener, and the gardener is going to sleep, right? This is what Draghi's saying.
Right. Okay.
He's saying, look at the productivity of Europe. He's saying, since 2000, when Europeans and Americans had the same income, now Europeans are only as 3/4 as rich as Americans. So our productivity has collapsed by about 25% vis-a-vis the Americans, right?
Yeah.
Why is this? And if our productivity collapses, which is output per worker and income per worker and therefore profit per worker, etc., we will not be able to lead the world, even though the world might not necessarily want to be led by Europeans. We still have this sort of thing that we were the big powers in the 19th century, number one. We will not be able to lead in technology. We will be overtaken by Asia and the United States. And we won't have the income to support the welfare, social welfare model that we've always wanted. And of course, fifthly, that lack of ambition will end up being paid for by the younger generation who don't get opportunities, and the older generation sit on their arses, drink wine, and go to Tuscany. So, I mean, in parenthesis. But the fascinating thing is also, from an economic perspective, is there such a thing as an undeveloping economy? So the idea that economies are rich and then they have a period in the sun and then they become poorer because somebody else overtakes them, become relatively poor. That's a very, very old idea in economics. But the basic idea is that once you get rich, you don't really get poor. Other people just get richer than you. So you maintain a certain level of social cohesion, of social equality, of lifestyle, etc., etc. But maybe there's another idea that basically countries can become undeveloping, that you invest so little and you save so much and you hoard so much wealth that in actual fact you go backwards quite quickly. This is like the end of the Roman Empire sort of stuff, right?
Yeah. But is this what Draghi is getting at, to undo this, or?
What Draghi is saying is that this is what is happening to the continental Europe economy, and that it's based on an inability to boost productivity. And if we don't boost productivity, Europe will fail. And by that, he's also looking at all the right-wing movements and the nationalist movements all over Europe that are basically saying, you know what, Brussels is a concept of the last century and we don't need it anymore and we've got to move on. But what he's highlighting is the more nationalist we become, the less we can benefit from the benefits of supranationalism, which is the single market and all those sort of things.
Right, okay.
So that's where we should go with today's podcast, is to look at why Europe is actually fracturing, why Europe is going backwards and what can be done. Or is it, and I'm going to call this podcast, the assassination of Schumpeter in Europe? That the Schumpeterian growth idea, John, has always been that innovation comes from the human. willingness to take a risk, what Keynes called the animal spirits and what Schumpeter called the relentless gales of creative destruction. And has Europe stopped those gales through regulation, through overregulation, through government intervention, through preventing people doing this, that, and the other? And that collectively, although at the individual basis doesn't appear too bad, when you add it all up together, you get a collective stagnation of the society.
I was reading a book recently by a fella called McWilliams, I think it was.
God, jeez, he's great. I tell you, that fella
should go to number one.
That fella.
But
the Duran of economics.
One of the arguments in the book that you make is that you kind of, in a roundabout way, in the presence of money, innovation occurs.
Yes.
It's like the fertilizer, going back to the garden analogy. It's like the fertilizer. It sparks innovation. It sparks something in our head and things change. So on that basis, just to start there, Draghi is essentially trying to be the gardener, scattering wildflower seeds.
Yeah, and say let's go for it. But you know what? We should have some sort of structure. So he's a gardener with a plan.
Yeah,
right?
Every gardener needs a plan.
Yeah, exactly. So he's a
gardener.
gardener.
My brother. He's a professional gardener.
I know. I heard from an English teacher to a professional gardener.
Yeah.
That I love that's a mid-season change.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But before we talk about this, I want to read from what Europe used to be. Because I told you the other day, I'm reading this great book by Philip Blom, The Vertigo Years, Change and Culture in the West, 1900 to 1914. And it's all about Europe. It's not about, when we talk about the West, not about America. But he makes the point, right? He says the 1900s this year were nothing if not dynamic. Everything appeared bigger today than it was yesterday. Cities, industrial production, railway networks, streets with automobiles hurtling down, high-rise buildings with stern facades, populations, media, entertainment, mass culture, speed, records, gripped between the steely jaws of industry and the emerging global markets. Millions were uprooted and forced to invent new identities in an unfamiliar world. This is all about Europe, right? Despite this dynamism, the spectre of degeneration and decline was a haunting, constant presence in European minds. Eugenicists warned about the decline of race. Conservative publicists foretold the end of civilization. Empires anxiously eyed one another's military might. Never before was there so much reason to be optimistic, and never before had people looked towards the future with stronger misgivings. And what the book describes, from Freudianism to Nietzsche to racism to all these extraordinary, what do you call it, the background noise to economic growth, right, was a continent just brimming with ideas. Some really good, some really bad.
Yeah.
But all stemming from almost a dynamic, almost like an electrical current zapping through society, right? This is what makes it so fascinating, this book. We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
That's kind of gone now. That's what Draghi's saying. He's got to go back to that.
Okay, so why was it different then to now?
Well, I think that the late 19th century, early 20th century was a period of so much scientific innovation and scientific discovery.
But that hasn't really
so
stopped.
Much industrial discovery coming from scientific discovery, that what you had was a total... Now, what this book talks about is not just the actual physical change, but the psychological change. And he's making the point. So, for example, men became very emasculated in the early 19th century. There's all sorts of ads for enlargement of penises, John, in newspapers in the 19th century because
really?
Yeah, because the suffragette movement, because women were saying, look, we're equal. You know, we're changing. We're going to use sexuality of power and all this sort of stuff. There's really fascinating stuff. Right. It talks about the emergence of consumer culture, the emergence of a new bourgeoisie, all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But what it was these were the problems of rapid change. What Draghi's talking about are the problems of rapid stagnation. That we've had all this great effervescence, and now Europeans want to be protected by the big state, which is like, for example, what
we got tired, as I said, we got tired of all that activity.
Tired of all that activity, exactly, all that jumping around the place, right? Now, of course, I am still very keen for the jumping around the place.
Of course.
But so what Draghi's saying is, unless we stop this decline, Europe risks failure. And when I say Europe, it's the European project. such as has been defined since 1957, since the Treaty of Rome. So the European Union being emblematic of it, peace in Europe being the product of it, security in Europe being the upshot of it, the fact that Europeans live well and we have a nice lifestyle. These are all the fruits of the last 50 years of what we call European progress. But underpinning all that has always been productivity and Schumpeterian innovation, right? Because Europeans did create good companies. But now, only 4 of the top 50 companies in the world are European.
Wow, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary.
That's a really bad show.
Yeah, in comparison to America and China, we have very few unicorns. They are new companies with revenues of over $1 billion.
Yeah.
There is no real venture capitalist infrastructure in Europe to finance young companies.
Yeah.
Companies, and you see it in Ireland, that really want to grow, go to America for money and eventually sell to American finance simply to actually exit because they can't generate the scale they need outside of the United States.
Yeah.
So all these things are contributing to this general malaise. And if you look at the economics of it, what it comes down to is Europe's problem is it's fragmented. We talk about the single market, right? And Europe has a market of 400 million people, but do we really?
Why wouldn't we?
Because you try and get insurance in Ireland,
right,
issued by an Italian insurer at Italian rates of insurance, and you won't get them. There is no single market.
It's also, I suppose, like if I wanted to get a better interest rate by putting my money, my very little money, into a German bank or an Italian bank, you can't do it.
So there is no single market. So
right.
this idea, idea that Europe is a single market of 400 million people, no, it's not. There are so many. If you want to export cups, I'm having a cup of tea here, so I just saw a cup, from Ireland to Italy, fine, you can. But if you want to import services, which is when we're actually a service economy, like, as you say, get insured in Ireland by an Italian company, right, or German, or get a German bank account, for example.
Or get a mortgage from
a French bank at much lower interest. You cannot do it, right? There is no single market.
So is that a function of the fact that the EU idea and the single market idea was a really good one, but we didn't go kind of all the way?
I just think there are too many very, very clear incidences where this is not available to people. That's the first thing. So we talk about that, right? So that's the first thing. It's fragmentation. So the alleged European market of 400 million people is still a market of 28 odd countries with their own idiosyncrasies, right? Overregulation. Europeans regulate to hell. And what we find is that national regulation is doubled down by European regulation, so that we have all sorts. I mean, you can talk about the European Commission and the Apple case the other day, right? Whether the rights or wrongs of it. But that is basically part of the European regulatory framework. Now, what the Europeans say is that this is trying to create an honorable settlement. But the Americans just say you're interfering with business. Now, we can be agnostic on that, but it's clearly a thing, right? And then, of course, the problem is too much savings. Europeans don't invest enough. We save too much.
And that's a function of age as well, I suppose.
It's a function of age and attitude, right? Age in the sense that as people get older, they tend to save more and spend less because we become much more sedentary and much less likely to go out and have a feed of pints and then go out to a nightclub. You and I, those days are, I think, behind us, right? So our Friday night, we're watching Netflix and having a takeaway, drinking a bottle of wine, whereas our kids are out spending, okay?
Our money.
Our money, yeah. But that's the way it goes, right? And then, of course, there is the fixation with fiscal probity in Europe, where we've got these rules and regulations, largely Germanic, about 3% of this and 2% of that, and no sense of flexibility when it comes to public spending and public investment.
Explain that a little bit more.
Well, you see, this comes from a thing called Ordo economics, ORDO, which is the German post-Second World War obsession with balanced budgets, all the way going back to our friends in the Weimar Republic and the hyperinflation there in the 1920s, right? And ironically, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, comes from this bizarre academic economic purism. It's an economic evangelicism which sees all fiscal deficits as a problem.
Right.
But of course, if people are savings. So the national saving ratio is going up. And if the governments are not spending, what you have is you have excess savings. You have too much savings, a surplus of savings, which is what we have in Europe. And if you have a surplus of savings and people are not investing, well, then you have what's called a current account surplus, right? And that means other people are using our money, not Europeans, right?
Okay.
And our money is getting stuck in the banks. And the banks are not so much, as we discussed actually on the podcast tour, the banks are not so much distributors of credit between savers and investors.
Yeah.
They are actually safe deposit boxes for older people.
Yeah.
And the money just gets stuck there.
So
right?
this sets off all the alarm bells.
Well, this is the end result of order economics, right? That's what you'll get to, which Keynes described this as a liquidity trap. He said it is as useful as pushing on a string, which is a lovely metaphor. Okay. So that's another problem with Europe. And then the final one is kind of relative conservatism when it comes to business. So, for example, in the United States, if you have failed in business, you're a success.
Yeah.
Right? If you go out and say, I failed, it's the American origin story is like a Tin Pan Alley origin story. It's all about, I started down here in the ghetto and now I'm up here. Look at me. And I've got a big house and a Tesla, right? And on the way to getting a Tesla.
JD Vance.
Yeah, on the way to get Tesla, I failed twice. And only by failing did I learn. And now I'm going to write a bestseller, about failure, right? Europeans run a mile from failure. Europeans don't want failure.
Yeah.
Right? It's like if you failed, you're tainted, you're soiled.
Yeah.
You're soiled goods, right?
Yeah.
And of course,
other people are pointing the finger at you.
and over time that impacts on the commercial backdrop and on the commercial legacy. And that's why I'm talking about undeveloping countries. That maybe if you take all this together, you have countries that are going backwards. And that's why I think Europe and Ireland, there was a lot of stuff about Ireland being non-European and we haven't that much influence. I think that's what's happening. I think Ireland is becoming more and more American and more of the parts of America that are very, very positive. So the really energetic commercial part of America, the stuff that JD Vance hates actually.
Yes.
Yeah, he hates big companies, whereas we love big companies, big American companies because they generate tax. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on.
Okay, hang on a second. Let's go back to Draghi and his big idea. Like, how will this 800 billion every year fix this European dilemma? Well, let's talk about that after a bit of this.
Cool.
So, Mark, getting back to Draghi, like, will this idea of ploughing 800 billion euro into the economy, into the European-wide economy every year, like, how will that fix the malaise that's setting into Europe?
Well, let's look. So the European economy is an economy, let's look at those big figures, right?
Yeah.
Of about 17 trillion euros, right? So that's 17,000 billion every year. So although Draghi's figure of 800 billion sounds like a lot, in the context of 17,000 billion as the basic GDP, you're talking percentages, small percentages of that.
Okay.
So it's not a huge figure, right? So we've got to actually stabilize, right? No. But I mean, in terms of it's 4% of GDP. That's not a big deal for a mature country to be spending. So that's why, number one, the figure, although it sounds huge, in the context of European income is pretty insignificant.
Yeah.
Secondly, what he's saying is, that has to be an aspiration for investment. Now, how do you do that? You do that with a combination of fiscal and monetary policy, right?
Well, I was going to say, is that money just be printed by the ECB?
No, I mean,
like a QE kind of vibe?
No, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be. I think his basic idea is to have all sorts of funds made available to investors by the European Central Bank and by a variety of government agencies to encourage people to go out and borrow. Right?
Yeah.
So, for example, if we wanted to expand the podcast, right?
Yeah.
And we went down to Bank of Ireland and Bank of Ireland said, no, I wouldn't give you money in a month of Sundays. That means that the podcast couldn't expand for not want of ideas or ambition, but for want of cash. So the idea would be that you'd set up all sorts of ways in which money could be funneled into the economy. Now, one way of doing it would be very, very much opening up the spigots of the European Central Bank. But that would require somebody at the top of the European Central Bank to have a very, very big vision of, Europe, I'm not too sure the present constellation has that.
Yeah.
Right?
There'd be also the fear of inflation and all sorts of
The-
other
but
unintended consequences.
Again, the things that Europe, if Europe could generate inflation through economic dynamism, we would be really, really happy.
Okay,
Because
yeah.
inflation can also be a reflection of just a little bit of oomph in the economy,
Yeah.
a little bit of, an accelerator in effect, right? But what Draghi is saying is that in the absence of this sort of unleashing of the European economy, we are going to stagnate. And that's a real, real fear. And if Europe stagnates, then all those nationalist parties that are saying that Europe is the problem will actually have a legitimate reason to say the reason our country is on its knees is because of Europe.
This economic nationalism.
And so you get this very, very vicious cycle where European underperformance leads to national insecurity leads to a fear of migrants and a fear of foreigners, and you vote for nationalism, and then nationalists at the European Parliament and in the European Council will argue against more European funds, and suddenly you end up with this vicious cycle where in actual fact Europe, the notion is being blamed for issues that are not necessarily European, but I come back to
and then you have the Brexiteers going, nah.
Well, the Brexiteers, I wouldn't even worry about the Brexiteers because they've got their own problem. But we've got to get back to the idea. The problem in Europe is not a nation state.
Yeah.
So I'm quite happy with it not being a nation state, by the way. By the mean, I quite like countries having their own sovereignty and all that sort of stuff. But your European budget is about 1% of European GDP, so it's not real. Like the
What
Irish,
do you mean?
So the European budget, which is administered by the European Union, is about 1% of European GDP. The Irish budget's about 30% of Irish GDP.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you think about the British is about 35%, French is about 50%. So Europe is just a notion. It's a flag. It's not a real thing.
Right.
And every now and then we get these 4 years of the European Union, European Parliament, thumbs up, thumbs down.
But if we were more European, if we were more integrated, would that help? Would that change stuff?
This is the interesting thing, is that most pro-Europeans always default to the idea of more Europe.
Yeah.
I would say, look, do us a favor, get your single market right. Allow John to deposit money in a German bank and get 2 or 3% interest rates rather than getting scalped
in
here.
a big Swiss safe.
Yeah. Or exactly. Or allow us to get car insurance in France.
Yeah.
Just let somebody provide that.
Yeah.
Do not over-regulate the banking system so that if a European bank wants to come and set up here, they have to jump through a million hoops at the central bank, right? Get real. Get real. Don't give us rhetoric. And then when we go to actually do something in Europe, tie us up in, it's not red tape, but just in different legislations, right? So allow the single market to work as it is, right? But more importantly, I think, what prompted Draghi to write this warning for Europe was the fact that since the year 2000, European incomes have fallen 25% vis-a-vis American incomes. And the question was this American policy? Was this great resurgence of the United States the response to a brilliant piece of intellectualism from the American elite, which said we must invest more and do this? No. The reason America is doing so well at the moment is American corporations, back to Schumpeter, did their thing. The Googles and the Facebooks and all these companies just did their thing. Now, in fairness, Joe Biden's Build Back Better is like an American version of Draghi's plan. But Joe Biden's Build Back Better is only the last 4 years.
Yeah.
Whereas where the Americans got their head start was in after the collapse of .com in 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
And the Americans have dealt with 2008 and all that sort of stuff. But the point is, the success of the United States didn't come as a result of a big plan by a big genius like a Mario Draghi, right? The success of the United States comes from the implementation of Schumpeter's worldview, which is that innovation is an evolutionary process. And as long as the evolutionary process is allowed to flourish, companies will emerge, bad companies will go, good companies will emerge, and we progress. And the question then is whether European regulations is in the business of preserving bad old companies and strangling new companies.
Yeah.
If we go back to Germany, we see that most of the German companies, the very, very big companies in Europe, are German, and most of them are over 150 years old.
Yeah.
150 years old. So they were starting, remember I read about the vertigo years, 1900, they started just before that.
Yeah.
So most of them maybe 120, 130 years old, right? There has been no big emergence of German companies, Italian companies, French to a smaller degree, right? Now, it's very, very clear that industrial policy at the macro level helps. Like nobody is going to say that Airbus, which was the product of industrial policy, wasn't a good idea. But in order to do this, you need European-wide industrial policy. And what we're still getting is industrial policy. It's French industrial policy, German industrial policy, Dutch, all that sort of thing. So I think what is the problem is, to kind of conclude, John, or to at least move towards a conclusion, is that Europe is still an idea. It's not really a reality.
Yeah.
And as long as it's not a reality, Europe doesn't acquire the advantages of scale that the alleged European market is supposed to deliver, in contrast to the Americans. And all the while, of course, you have China is growing at an extraordinary degree, is innovating in every area, in green tech, in fintech, in health tech, and in basic but upscale manufacturing. China is doing everything that Europe used to do 100 years ago. And I'm also not too sure that Europeans want the sort of lifestyle changes that are necessary.
Well, it's the work-life balance, Max.
Exactly.
We want to keep that.
No, exactly. But, the reason you like France so much, rural France, is that it has a sense of tradition, permanence, security, work-life balance. You have time to eat together.
Wine.
Lots of wine. But, you have time, family time. You have time to go out on your strolls and your walks. Everything is not seen through the prism of money and the dollar.
Exactly. Well, see,
and
that's
everything is not seen through the prism of income. Like, you'd probably be seen as a bit of an Egypt if you arrived in a French village in a big fancy Tesla.
Yeah.
And not a second-hand Renault.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's true.
You'd probably be an Egypt if you were saying, "Oh, sorry, I'm working this weekend." The French just look and you say, "What?" Okay.
But it is the weekend.
No, but then the Dutch people are the same. And the German people are the same. So Europeans pay in their pocket for a lifestyle that probably means we live longer, we live healthier, we have less mental health problems, we have less social problems, and the societies are slightly more coherent. What Draghi is saying, to come back to him, is that is yesterday's Europe. And unless we can actually kickstart the economy, all those good things will end up disappearing because we can't pay for them. And so this is the problem. It's a sort of a 30 or 40 year view of Europe through the prism of somebody who's been very successful, who's been quite Americanized in his worldview, who worked for Goldman Sachs, let's not forget. And he stands in direct contrast to lots of Europeans who are saying, "Do you know what? This is a fine place to live." And that's the conflict at the heart of Europe. And I'm not too sure which one's right.